What's up, and welcome to Chapter 28 of AMSCO U.S. History, Promises and Turmoil in the 1960s. Please make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, like, comment, and share these videos with your friends. Thanks so much. The 60s began with the election of John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, at 43, was the youngest candidate ever to be selected president. He promised to lead the nation through his domestic program called the New Frontier. He put both business executives and important academics, such as the famous economist John Kenneth Galbraith, into his cabinet. He also chose his younger brother, Robert, who was an up-and-coming political star, as the Attorney General. His wife, named Jackie, brought style, glamour, and an appreciation of the arts to the White House. They were the it couple during this time. The New Frontier was difficult to keep because of a lot of Republican resistance, but it wanted aid to education, federal support of healthcare, an urban renewal project, and civil rights for all people. Congress stalled these acts, but they were later passed under President Johnson. Economically, he dealt with steel executives. He got the steel executives to roll back a price increase on steel, and he also helped the economy by stimulating increased spending for defense and space exploration. This helped the U.S. economy to grow more during the 60s. He also committed the nation to land on the moon by the end of the decade, known as the space race. However, things didn't go quite as planned at first. His first mistake came when he approved a CIA plan under the Eisenhower administration to use Cuban exiles in America to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba. This was an example of covert action. Fidel Castro was a military dictator who took over the island after a revolution. In April of 1961, the CIA-trained force of Cubans landed at the Bay of Pigs, shown right here in southern Cuba, and they tried to set off a general uprising of other Cubans, but it failed. And these anti-Castro Cubans were trapped on the beach, and Kennedy didn't want to use U.S. forces to save them, so they had to surrender. Castro saw this as a potential invasion attempt by the U.S., and he used it to gain more aid from the Soviet Union and communist countries and to strengthen his grip on his nation's power. The most dangerous challenge from the Soviets during the Cold War came in October of 1962. A U.S. spy plane had discovered Russians building underground sites in Cuba that could launch these missiles, nuclear warheads, to the United States in minutes. As you know, Cuba is only 90 miles from the tip of Florida. So, as a response, the Kennedy administration set up a naval blockade of Cuba until these weapons were removed. Full-scale nuclear war seemed imminent if the Soviet ships challenged the U.S. naval blockade of Cuba and continued to ship nuclear arms to Cuba. Days later, however, Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviets, finally agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. Kennedy, in turn, pledged not to invade the island nation like attempted at the Bay of Pigs, and to later remove some U.S. missiles pointed at Russia and Turkey. There were also many effects. A telecommunications hotline was established between Washington and Moscow to make it possible for the two leaders to talk directly during a crisis, so a direct phone line. Also, these two countries signed a nuclear test ban treaty ending the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, and it was the first step in controlling the testing of nuclear arms in the world, but it also set up another arms race for developing missile and warhead superiority to a new level. And this is a very famous political cartoon. Whoever wins, I guess, sets off nuclear arms to the other country. Across the Cold War, there was many brushfire wars fought in different places around the world on behalf of the United States and Soviet Union. These insurgent forces were often aided by Soviet arms and training, and also by U.S. arms and training. The Kennedy administration adopted a policy of flexible response. It basically said no to Doli's idea of massive retaliation and reliance on nuclear weapons. It instead increased spending on conventional, which were non-nuclear arms, and mobile military forces. This reduced the risk of using nuclear weapons in these regions, but it also increased the temptation to send special elite forces, such as the Green Berets of the Army, to try to battle out insurgents across the globe. Even though much of America was prosperous during this time, there was still a big percentage that was poor. In Michael Harrington's best-selling book on poverty called The Other America, it helped to focus national attention on the 40 million Americans still living in poverty, and this eventually would influence the Democrats' domestic plans in the years that followed. In 1963 in Dallas, Texas, JFK was assassinated, and Lyndon B. Johnson became the president soon after. In 1964, based on the book we just talked about, Johnson declared an unconditional war on poverty. He called for the Democratic Congress to pass and create an Office of Economic Opportunity, and this anti-poverty agency had $1 billion budget. It had many self-help programs for the poor, such as help for preschoolers, vocational education, for jobs training, literacy programs, and even legal services. There was also a controversial community action program that allowed the poor to run anti-poverty programs in their own neighborhoods. Of course, that probably led to corruption. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. Eventually, the costly Vietnam War ended, but the war on poverty did significantly reduce the number of American families living in poverty. So, LBJ's domestic policy was called the Great Society Program, and it was very similar to the New Frontier. It called for many things, such as seen in this chart on the left, and it also called for increased funding for mass transit, public housing, and rent subsidies for low-income people, and crime prevention. This was really targeted at the poor. It also had two new administrations, a Department of Transportation and Department of Housing and Urban Development. This, of course, tried to help the poor people in inner cities again. The administration also passed regulations of the automobile industry, such as a speed limit, which would save hundreds of thousands of lives in the following years because people didn't drive so fast and the physics weren't so dangerous. There was also clean air and water laws that were enacted as part of a response to Rachel Carson's famous expose of pesticides known as Silent Spring, published in 1962. Federal parks and wilderness areas were expanded to make America more grand. And his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, had a Beautify America campaign, which resulted in the Highway Beautification Act, removed lots of billboards from federal roads across the country. In 1962, a newly formed radical student organization called the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, formed. They issued a statement called the Port Huron Doctrine, where they met up, and it called for university decisions to be made through participatory democracy, so students could have a voice in the universities that they attended. The activists and intellectuals who supported this were known as the New Left. The first major speech protest took place in 1964 at UC Berkeley. It was called the Free Speech Movement because these students wanted to end university restrictions on political activities, and a bunch of university rules were challenged, such as drinking and dorm visits by members of the opposite sex. They also demanded a greater voice in the government of the university and how things were run, and it grew with the escalation of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. The students really didn't want to be involved in Vietnam, so they went against this. Campuses disrupted or closed many of these anti-war practices, and there were even a group of radicals known as Weathermen who resorted to violence and vandalism in their attacks on these institutions, and that sort of discredited the early idealism of the New Left and the new liberalism of this time. The New Left also started an era of counterculture, which included a lot of political protests. This counterculture was expressed by young people in rebellious styles of dress, music, drug use, and sometimes communal living, where people lived in combines. These people were frequently called hippies, which they're better known as, and also flower children. They had long hair, beards, beads, and jeans, so this was different from the normal dress of the time, nonconformity. Folk music, such as that by Bob Dylan, gave voice to the younger protests, and also the rock music of groups such as the Beatles and Rolling Stones provided the beat and lyrics for this new movement. In 1969, there was a gathering of young people at the Woodstock Music Festival against the conformity at the times. This was in Upper New York State. These people experimented with hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD, and sometimes they were addicted to these. A lot of them smoked weed. And these excesses and the economic uncertainties of times in the 70s led to its demise eventually. After World War II, women got increased opportunities for education and employment. And with the Civil Rights Movement and the Sexual Revolution, the women's movement really took off in the 60s. Betty Friedan, who was a famous feminist, wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963. It encouraged middle-class women all across America to seek fulfillment in professional careers in addition to fulfilling traditional roles such as wife, mother, and homemaker, that cult of domesticity. In 1966, she also helped found the National Organization for Women, known as NOW, and it wanted to secure equal treatment of women, especially for job opportunities. These feminists also achieved a major legislative victory during this time. In 1972, Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment, better known as ERA, And it said that the equality of rights under law should not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state based on sex. So this helped to make men and women supposedly more equal. Now, and the other groups campaigned hard for the ratification of the ERA across the United States, but it missed acceptance or ratification by the required 38 states of the United States. And this really failed because of the growing reaction against feminism, so reactionary conservatism, who feared that this movement threatened the traditional roles of values of women at home. Foreign policy-wise, things were heating up. Lyndon Johnson took president after Kennedy was assassinated, and things were really starting to fall apart in South Vietnam. There was limited war before, as the administration had sent in some military advisors, but in August of 1964, Johnson and Congress decided to put more resources into Vietnam. He made use of a naval incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, which was off of Vietnam's coast, where basically Vietnam ships supposedly fired on American ships. This allowed Congress to authorize U.S. forces to go into combat. And Congress approved this Tonkin Gulf resolution. It basically gave the president, who's the commander-in-chief of the military, a blank check to take all necessary measures to protect U.S. interests in Vietnam and to provide more stability into the region. The U.S. now had an excuse to get involved in Vietnam, and in the Lunar New Year, also known as the Tet, in January 1968, the Viet Cong, who were the communists, really didn't like the United States, so they launched an all-out surprise attack on basically every capital and military base in South Vietnam. Well, the U.S. military obviously didn't like this, so they counterattacked and had given the Viet Cong much heavier losses, and they recovered much of the lost territory. However, the power of TV, broadcast all this destruction to millions in America, and it made America look bad. And so for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, the Tet was a tremendous political victory in demoralizing the American public. Suddenly, the American public wasn't behind this war anymore. They wanted out of Vietnam and the horrors of it. Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren, who became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 53 to 69, and his impact was so huge. The effects he did to the court were like John Marshall's in the early 1800s. Before he was Chief Justice, the Supreme Court had really concentrated on protecting property rights, so it really helped business out. But during and after his tenure, the court focused more on protecting individual rights. The biggest case during his time was the desegregation case of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and it really started to focus more on the person's right in the First Amendment. Some of these included criminal justice reform in the 60s, where state political systems were changed and also individual rights were strengthened. For example, evidence could not be illegally seized to be used in courts. Also, courts had to help the poor people by giving them an attorney. Also, police needed to inform people the right to remain silent, and a lawyer needs to be present or be made available for questioning a defendant if they ever need help. So this is the famous Miranda versus Arizona case in 1966, where the Miranda rights came to be even still crucial today, the right to remain silent. Also, the principle of one man, one vote became more powerful. Election districts had to be redrawn, so no more messing up districts to try to win votes to provide equal representation for all citizens in an area. Freedoms of expression and privacy, this really applied to communists, so it protected the actions of protesters against like Vietnam. It allowed people to have more freedom, communists again. It also separated religious activities from public schools, so separation of church and state, such as prayers in schools, and it also guaranteed adults' rights to use contraceptives, which eventually led to abortion. The defense of the rights of unpopular individuals was very common during this time, and many people think this court was probably the most liberal of the United States ever. Robert Kennedy, who was JFK's brother, was going to run for president in 1968, but after one of his primaries in California, he got shot and assassinated. So the election of 1968 turned into a three-way race between two conservatives, George Wallace of Alabama and Richard Nixon, who was the famous prosecutor and former vice president from California, and also one liberal, Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Anti-war protesters were at the Democratic Convention, and the vice president at the time, Hubert Humphrey, left the convention as the nominee. But the Democratic Party was really divided because some people really wanted the war to be finished, while some really wanted to make sure America got their containment through. And he tried to preach to the faithful of the old New Deal coalition, so FDR times people. Southern whites didn't like desegregation, which was going on at the time. These anti-war protests and race riots were also, in their minds, contributing to the decline of America. So Governor George Wallace of Alabama ran, and he didn't like the two-party system, so he ran as a self-nominated candidate of a third party, the American Independent Party. And he wanted to win enough electoral votes to throw it into the House of Representatives because, they decide in case of electoral vote tie. In 1968, a new, more confident, and less negative Nixon, who lost to JFK 8 years earlier, picked a governor of Maryland, Spiro Agnew, and that was similar to George Wallace, kind of, that guy, Spiro Agnew was, and he ran on the slogans of peace with honor and law and order to try to restore order to America. Eventually, Wallace didn't succeed, and Nixon defeated Humphrey, but it also showed that the combination of Nixon's and Wallace's popular vote, the conservatives, which totaled 57%, showed that most Americans were actually against this liberalism and counterculture of this era. The elections in the 70s and 80s would confirm this. So in conclusion, this has been Chapter 28 of AMSCO U.S. History, Promises and Turmoils, all about the 60s. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.